This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. Today, we're talking about caregiving and the people caught in the middle. The so-called sandwich generation refers to the millions of Americans who find themselves squeezed between caring for aging loved ones and raising children, all while trying to keep up with work and the rest of life's demands. My guest, Kelli Korducki, recently wrote an article for Business Insider called America's Biggest Career Hurdle, Being a Daughter. Her work sheds light on some of the hardships faced by the sandwich generation. Kelli, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
And so your story centers on someone named Allison Hale. Can you tell us about her and her experience?
Sure. Well, Allison Hale is one of a few people that I spoke to for this story, and she is she's a mother of two, single mom living in the Pacific Northwest. And in 2023, it became very clear that her mother, who was in her late 60s at that time, could no longer live on her own. And her mother had struggled with alcohol use for many, many years, and it was beginning to affect her cognitive function. And so for Allison, who was dealing with raising two teens on her own and working full time in a kind of demanding job as a marketing director for a retirement plan advisor, she was left on her own to deal with this situation and kind of manage her demanding job, managing parenting two teens, and figuring out what was the best thing to do with her mom, who had very, very, very little retirement savings.
Well, and your story has a focus on the responsibilities often falling on the daughters. Is that something that you discovered while you were doing the story?
Yeah, it's funny. The story came to me while I was just it popped up to me in a news feed about costs of living things, and I saw a headline for the daughterhood tax, is what it was called. And yeah, there apparently this is a turn of phrase that has been used for a number of years, and it refers to the kind of financial cost of the caregiving burden that so often does fall onto daughters specifically, which is sort of an extension of the cultural expectation that kind of women are the caregivers and the nurturers and the ones who end up doing the behind the scenes unpaid work that keeps society running and our economy running.
Well, and following that thought, because you described caregiving as one of the biggest career hurdles facing women, how does shouldering the majority of caregiving labor affect someone's ability to work? And that also involves earning promotions or being able to advance professionally.
Absolutely. So I believe this figure came from the AARP, but it's been estimated that the average woman gives up something like just short of $300,000 in earnings over the course of a lifetime from caregiving, and that comes from lost promotions, unworked hours, lost jobs, or having to leave the workforce either by choice or by force, and all these other factors. It takes a lot of time and it takes a lot of energy to take care of other people, right? And that energy and time ends up being taken out of the other commitments that also take time in a person's life. So work is often the first thing that takes a hit, because it's kind of the other great taker of time and energy.
Right. And I think it's one of those situations where there's a little irony, because you need the work in order to provide the financial foundation of being able to provide the quote unquote like extra care for your loved ones. When you were doing the story, or even just based on your conversation with the people that you were chatting with, are people surprised at the extent of what caregiving really entails? And of course, naturally, case by case basis, but it feels like it's always a lot more than people expect.
Yeah, one thing that really struck me in speaking with the number of women that I spoke to is that it's just so incredibly isolating. It's a really it can feel it can feel very lonely and alienating to be a primary caregiver. It's just such a round the clock duty, and it takes so much energy and effort. And a couple of women that I spoke with told me that other people in their lives, their social, their friends, and the people that they kind of relied on for their own emotional well-being, many of those people drifted away when they became full-time caregivers, especially for ailing parents. Something about sickness and about vulnerability, it can be very difficult for other people to handle. It's just something that we don't spend very much time as a society really talking about and figuring out how to manage collectively. And that, yeah, that was quite striking to me. It's really, really difficult. I think in general, those of us who are not in a position of having to take care of particularly older or chronically ill people, I think don't really necessarily understand all that goes into that.
Right, and sort of related to what you just described, because you also write about a growing divide among families, so a different kind of or different sense of isolation here, where some aging parents are able to pass on wealth to their children, while others need significant financial support themselves. How is that shaping the experience of today's middle-aged adults?
Yeah, well, it's really interesting. Over the past couple of years, the oldest of the baby boomers turned 80 this year, or are turning 80 this year. Um, and so in the past couple of years, there have been many, many headlines about this great boomer wealth transfer, of something like $100 trillion that boomers are about to transfer onto their Gen X and millennial children. And in truth, when you look at the overarching population of the U.S., that actually relatively few millennials and Gen Xers are going to be benefiting from this supposed great wealth transfer. The vast majority of aging boomers are not in a really great place to retire. And an overwhelming majority will require long-term care for at least 5 years of their lives before the end of their lives. And very few people expect that they will need this care, and very few people are prepared for this to pay for this care. And it's very expensive. Allison Hale was telling me that she was had her mother in a memory care facility that cost nearly $10,000 a month.
Right.
That's an enormous sum of money, especially when you consider that a person may be needing to be in such care and in a facility like this, for multiple years, perhaps even decades. And these costs really add up. And the truth is that many, many, many middle class, professional, retired people who did all the quote unquote right things still are not in a position to be able to pay for these care facilities. And it's their children who are still working, who are now middle-aged adults, who need to often pick up the slack.
Well, and I also wonder during this process, and I think oftentimes, especially today, you may discover this a little too late, but a lot of people assume that Medicare covers long term elder care. What did you learn about the gaps in that system, and how do families discover those limitations?
Yeah, so Medicare doesn't cover that long-term care at all. It doesn't. So that's kind of the huge thing that a lot of people don't realize. Um, yeah, Medicare does not cover a long-term care facility. It does not cover long-term in-home care. And so there is, I think, a misconception among actually many people that this is the case. Um, and yeah, it's a rude awakening to realize when you're in the position of needing this kind of assistance, or that your loved one needs this assistance, and realizing in the moment of crisis that actually no, Medicare does not cover this.
Well, and you mentioned with Allison and her mother needing memory care, that's one cost that can be really staggering. Can you highlight some other costs that you've seen for various different kinds of support, like assisted living, in home care, and nursing homes?
Sure. Well, so last year, the national median cost for assisted living and in-home care was almost $80,000 per year. And so that's sort of the kind of the baseline, I guess, median for a private room in a nursing home. Okay, so just a nursing home where somebody has their own room. That figure is 129,000 per year. And that's more than double the $57,000 median household income of Americans 65 and older. So we're talking about a really big gap in what the average person has versus what the average person has to pay to get the kind of care that they need.
And coming back to Allison, because Allison also has to think about her own future. And when you spoke with her, was she already thinking about what her own retirement in aging years might look like after spending so much time and energy and money caring for someone else?
Yes. So Allison works, I may have mentioned earlier that she actually works for a retirement plan. So she's kind of already in this world of thinking about her just by virtue of her line of work.
Right.
Kind of thinking about next steps. But she's also had to kind of be pragmatic about, how much of her own savings she is willing to devote to her mother's care, because she does have two kids who still need to go to college, and they're the expenses for their lives are not completely um, there's still more going on there. So she sort of made a decision to um, she's put her mother into a lower cost facility that once her mother's savings get spent out, it will become it will convert to a Medicaid coverage plan. Um, and the trade-off there is that it's not as nice of a facility as a private, as the $130,000 private standard. But the trade-off there is that Allison gets to spare her own children from having to deal with the burden of paying for her own care in the future.
Well, and before we go to break, I want to ask, what was it about the subject of this story, or tell us why did you want to report this story in the first place? And I know we touched on this a little bit before, but what do you think people misunderstand or really are just not talking enough about when it comes to caregiving?
Well, caregiving is the backbone of our society and our economy, and it is overwhelmingly performed by women, and it is overwhelmingly performed for free. Um, I've always been interested in the ways that women's unpaid care work kind of are the presumed constant that keep things running. And at great expense to women professionally, personally. And it's not all a burden, but I think it's just important to consider what is sacrificed by half of our population on a daily basis and not recognized.
And was there anything about your own storytelling or the conversations that you have with the people that surprised you?
Yeah, I mean, it was interesting to hear from everyone that I don't think anybody thinks of the sacrifices that they've made as kind of a waste. Like, I spoke with one woman who has basically given up her entire adult independence and career to take care of her mother. She's been caring for her mother full time since she was 23 years old, and now she's 41. She's never had, since she was 23, she hasn't had a job outside of the home, outside of caring for her mom. She's unmarried, has not really dated, doesn't have a huge social life. Like, her life revolves around caring for her mom and has for her entire adult life. And a lot of people hear a story like that and think, oh my God, this poor woman's life has been wasted. And she, the woman I spoke with, and others that I spoke with, nobody feels that they've wasted anything by taking care of their loved ones. It's not a waste. They love the people that they're caring for, and they feel good about doing it. And that they're grateful that they are able to step up and be the ones to ensure that that care is given. But it's a huge sacrifice. It's a huge sacrifice. And it's a largely unrecognized sacrifice. And I think that, I know that everybody that I spoke with is really grateful to just have their stories told and heard.
You've been listening to Kelli Korducki, who is a journalist and author. Her recent Business Insider article is called America's Biggest Career Hurdle, Being a Daughter. Kelli, thank you so much for highlighting this issue with us today.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.
After the break, we'll continue our conversation about caregiving in America. This is Where We Live. Stay with us. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. Caregiving doesn't fall evenly across families. In the U.S., women continue to shoulder the majority of unpaid caregiving work, whether they're caring for children, aging parents, spouses, or other loved ones. My next guest has studied caregiving and gender for years. She's also lived it herself. Joining me now is Laura Mauldin, who's an associate professor in the Department of Social and Critical Inquiry at the University of Connecticut. And she's also the author of In Sickness and Health, Love Stories from the Front Lines of America's Caregiving Crisis. Laura, thank you so much for being here today. Oh, Laura, I think you might still be on mute.
Thank you so much for having me.
Nice
excited
to
talk with you.
Absolutely. And Laura, you were also listening to the conversation that we just had with journalist Kelli Korducki about daughters who became primary caregivers for aging parents. And I imagine that would resonate with a lot of people, and many families would say that those decisions are based on very practical factors like schedules and salaries or even proximity. And so from your perspective as a researcher, how does gender shape who ultimately takes on the caregiving role?
Sure. That's a really good question. I think that we have some really kind of large cultural assumptions about what women should do in society. And a lot of that comes from since, for hundreds of years that we have had women do the caretaking, primarily because their bodies are the ones that are the life force, right? We birth children. And because of that physical capacity, I think that we take that expectation and apply it to the social and say, oh, because your body can do these kinds of things, you must therefore be physically wired and more quote unquote naturally able to provide care, generally speaking, to anyone who needs it, regardless of the social, economic, political context. Like none of those things matter. It's just the fact that you're a woman. And so you should be able to do these things and also be happy doing those things without any kind of, again, pay, protection, all of these kinds of things.
Well, and of course, this is not just an academic topic for you. You also became a caregiver for your former partner while she was battling leukemia. What did that experience teach you about caregiving that maybe you could not have learned it from research alone?
Oh, absolutely. There was so much about that experience that I think in the moment I was like, oh, I'm actually living the things I read about. But it took a very long time, even as a researcher, for me to kind of look back and understand why some of the things played out the way they did. And of course, we talked about this sort of larger cultural expectation about what women can and should do and how they should feel about it. But for me, I was like, oh, that sort of larger cultural piece has infiltrated my very intimate personal experience of being raised as an eldest daughter, right? And being sort of enculturated and taught about what it means to take care of other people and how you're expected to do that. And that those things didn't happen to my brother per se, right? So we were actually raised and socialized in a different way, such that when the time to care sort of came up, here it is. What are you going to do? I knew what to do because I had been socialized to know what to do. It wasn't because I was naturally more capable, but I had been socialized to do that. And so that kind of competence to sort of step in and do that, it is a skill. It's a skill set, and it's a skill set that we've been taught.
When I think an overarching theme that we hear often about caregiving, especially today, is often the feeling of being invisible or feeling like there's invisibility. And so we'd love to get more of your thoughts about what that means for you. And I feel like the theme for today's conversation is to understand parts of caregiving that maybe we don't see or maybe we just don't know until we're actually living it ourselves.
Absolutely. So, one of the things that this sort of cultural belief does, and then this steady socialization of individuals to do the work, one of the things that it does is it isolates us from one another. And this came up in the previous segment, this experience of isolation. And when you look at research so there's, two wonderful organizations, AARP and the National Alliance for Caregiving, who these two organizations work together to put out research and data every 5 years on caregiving in America. And it's really helpful, actually, to go and look at some of that because they do find that it actually bears out when you survey caregivers. You can see that the majority of them feel isolated. The majority are experiencing mental health effects from this, in addition to the sort of logistical, practical problems, right? There's actual fallout emotionally and mentally that I think we often don't talk about. And we particularly don't talk about it with caregivers because we're so isolated from one another. And we think that we're supposed to be okay with what is put upon us, and such that we feel guilty for not always being happy about it, or feeling guilty for feeling resentful or angry or completely burnt out and unable. Sometimes you feel unable to go on, but there's not a choice. You've got to. And so you just get more and more lost in yourself, in your own isolation. And I think that it's really important that people understand that it is not an individual failing to feel those feelings. It is a product of a social problem, a larger social problem that we have made bad decisions about whom we assign caregiving duties to and how we do that. And that is a social problem, not an individual failing.
Well, it sounds like based on what you just shared, sort of the listicle of emotions that you could go through or still are going through if you're caregiving at this moment is a much more common experience than people think. Hence the isolation. But there's actually a lot of people who experience the same things. And you yourself have written really candidly about your own caregiving experience. What has that been like for you, being vulnerable with others? And I imagine there's probably a lot of people who share their own stories with you because you did that.
Yes. I mean, listen, writing about this and putting it in the book often feels terrible because it's terrifying. And at the same time, I get emails from people that, from strangers who write and say, I had those same, feelings. I had the same struggles. And to hear you, to see you write about that helped me to feel less alone. And that is the whole point of the book, is for people to feel less alone. And I do write in the book, as you mentioned at the top, in Sickness and in Health. It's not just my story. It is memoir, but it also weaves together the story of three other couples, a very intense, intimate, the stories span years. And these folks were so candid with me about what they went through and their mental health challenges as well. And so those are written really carefully to, again, just sort of let people know that you're not alone and there's nothing wrong with feeling those feelings and that other people are going through that as well. And I do write, as you mentioned, very candidly about my own PTSD from long-term caregiving. People who are caregivers a lot of times are dealing with highly sophisticated medical tasks. They're doing nursing tasks. They are literally responsible for whether somebody lives or dies. And often it's a very serious condition, and you're overwhelmed with having to watch what's happening to the person that you love.
Well, and on top of all of that you just described, I think oftentimes as a caregiver, you're not only actually providing care, but you're also navigating paperwork from insurance companies, appointments, and healthcare systems. How much of your time would you say you were spending doing that?
Yes, that takes up a huge amount of time. And in fact, a lot of the people that I talked to would tell me that they spent hours, sometimes on a daily basis, on the phone with insurance companies, with even people who had qualified for Medicaid, for example, which is very difficult to do. And Medicaid, in case people don't know, is the only public long-term care supports that we have. That's the only infrastructure we have in this country that is not private pay for long-term care. And these people that I spoke with who would they would get qualified for Medicaid and therefore and be approved for access to home care. And then they would spend years on the phone trying to sometimes battle with getting the number of people they need, getting the number of hours they need, because we also have not just private insurance, navigation and phone calls, but also moving through these sort of state, mechanisms. People don't know what they have a right to. They get access to it, but then can't get it. And then we also have a problem with home care pay. So home care pay is extraordinarily low. And so people would have to really fight and be on the phone constantly to get a new person in because the turnover rates would be so high, or just get the hours that they qualified for. So
Well,
it's a
and
lot of work.
when before we go to break, I want to touch on when you talk about fighting for pay, fighting for access, fighting for rights, and if we view caregiving more as a societal issue rather than a private family matter, what kind of policy changes do you think would make the biggest difference?
Oh, that's easy. First thing is universal health care, because actually lack of access to healthcare creates more long-term and chronic conditions and disability. So it's really ironic, because if we would just give more universal access to preventative care, then we could prevent some of these issues that require the caregiving. And then the second piece is, again, like I mentioned, Medicaid is the only infrastructure we have for long-term care. at home, and Medicaid also pays for a facility, but for at-home care. And I would love to see universal access to Medicaid and long-term care at home. I would love to see that. So those are two easy, quote unquote, easy solved.
Right, and hopefully we'll get an update on that soon as we follow both of your story and, of course, Kelli's from earlier. You've been listening to Laura Mauldin, who's the associate professor in the Department of Social and Critical Inquiry at the University of Connecticut. She's also the author of In Sickness and Health: Love Stories from the Front Lines of America's Caregiving Crisis. Laura, appreciate your time and thanks for sharing your story with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
And coming up, we'll hear directly from a Connecticut resident navigating the challenges of caregiving and the realities of life in the sandwich generation. And a quick note for our listeners, it is our June Fund Drive. Our programming is supported by listeners just like you. So if you're enjoying the show, we hope you'll consider letting us know by sending a donation, and thank you in advance. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. We spent this hour talking about the financial, professional, and societal challenges facing the sandwich generation. But behind all the statistics are real people juggling competing responsibilities every day as they care for children and aging loved ones. My next guest knows this firsthand. Natalie Shurtleff is Associate State Director of Advocacy and Outreach for AARP Connecticut. And Natalie's also a member of the Sandwich Generation. Thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you for having me.
So tell me a little bit about your family. Who are the people you're caring for and what brought you into this role in the first place?
Yeah, so I actually started this role really before I dove into, found myself in the sandwich generation. So I work for AARP supporting family caregivers, and I have two young children. I have a 3-year-old daughter and an 8-year-old son. And in this past year, I've seen my mom getting older and kind of knew that caregiving responsibility would be coming, but she faced a medical diagnosis in the past year. And so I found myself there in the sandwich generation, caring for her while also, the daily life of dealing with two young kids. So a lot of responsibilities kind of on both sides.
Well, and we just heard sort of the reportage of caregiving. We also heard research on caregiving, but also from two people who are caregivers themselves. And now you're sharing your story. We're reading the research, we're reading the stories, but what does caregiving actually look like in your daily life? What are some responsibilities that really fill up your days and weeks that people may not really think about?
Yeah, I mean, with the kids, it's the normal kid stuff. It's running to baseball games and practices and swimming lessons and picking them up from daycare and summer camp and all of those sorts of things that just fill up our days, and then trying to find time in between all of that to help care for my mom. So my mom does live out in California, so there's an added challenge of a distance. And I will say, in some ways, it can be it assists in some ways because I can't just stop by her house after work and everything. There's a little bit more of a barrier there, but it adds in additional challenges so that when she had surgery in this past year, I was flying out to California and staying for a little over a week while my husband was at home with our kids. And so, but even with the distance, I still find myself doing caregiving things for her. There was talk in the last segment about the phone calls and all of the paperwork that goes along with caregiving. And I'm supporting my mom through all of that. I often find myself in the remote tech support role, trying to figure out how to help her from 3,000 miles away figure out how to upload some form that her insurance company needs. And unfortunately, a lot of these processes are just way harder than they need to be, especially for someone who's not tech native, not who has a little bit more challenges with those sorts of things.
Well, we often talk about the pros and cons of that. There's ease to it, but it's also not accessible for many people, right? And with what your experience is like, do you ever feel like you're being pulled in not just two directions literally, but I imagine so many different directions where you want to be fully present for your children, but you're also worried about your mother's health, and you also have your own relationship that you need to spend time with, right?
Yeah, I mean, it feels like I'm being pulled in a lot of different directions, and I'm trying to be there for my kids. I'm trying to be there for my mom, support my husband. And I feel like oftentimes the last person that I'm taking care of is myself. And it's something that I hear a lot when I talk to other caregivers as well, is that you spend so much time caring as a caregiver. You take care of everyone else, but you don't take care of yourself. And then you can get burnt out. And it's really challenging to, go in all of these different directions. And there's this endless list of things to do. And it feels like I never get to the things that I need to get done, or even just that, things I want to do. And it feels selfish to take the time. But I think something that I always try to tell other caregivers when I'm talking to them is that you need to take care of yourself. If you burn out, if you aren't able to take care of your person, there's no one else there to do it. So you need to take care of yourself so that you don't get burnt out. It's kind of that airplane analogy. You got to put your own oxygen mask on before assisting those around you. Because if you pass out, then, you can't help the other person.
Well, and I wonder if it's one of those things where we all know the philosophy, right? But we need people to remind us that actually you need to practice what you preach to other people.
Yep.
And I was just thinking, one of my friends who's in her late 50s, and she just had to care for a great aunt who needed memory care, and she has passed, and everything was such a struggle, and it took her a while. It was many years of caregiving, and now she's finally at a place where she recognized that there was a lot of PTSD. She was the only one caregiving, and now she has a support system where people are telling her exactly what you just said. And I'm curious to hear, because you're straddling two worlds in a way where you're working with a system that is supporting the work with AARP. Has that shaped the way you think about your own experiences and also experiences of other caregivers, being a caregiver yourself personally, but you're also in a professional space that deals with that?
Yeah. I mean, I think in some ways I'm really fortunate because I work for an organization that truly understands the needs of caregivers. And so I get a lot of benefits that I think that more companies and more organizations should offer. So when I needed to fly out to California to be there with my mother, I had an incredible amount of flexibility in my job. My manager covered a meeting for me. I had caregiving leave that I could use that was separate from my sick time or vacation time, that was specifically there for me to use in hours that I needed to provide caregiving. And I also had the flexibility of remote work. And so I was able to spend a little bit of my time that I was out in California still working, but just remotely. And so I think that those types of things made it easier. And not everyone has that. Some people would have had to take that time off unpaid. There are a lot of caregivers that end up stepping out of the workforce or reducing their hours because they don't have the flexibility that is needed. And so I think the more that employers can do to support their employees, the more that, people don't have that burden solely on themselves.
Right, and I think oftentimes is knowing that you have the support makes the journey a little easier, right? And when you're in the thick of caregiving, what kinds of other supports do you think would make the biggest difference?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. Like, just knowing that support's there is incredible. I mean, I knew from the get-go that, my manager had my back. And that made me feel more comfortable taking the time and doing what I needed. And I wasn't worried about work. I was able to focus on my caregiving. And so I think more things like that, more flexibility, more just showing up and showing that you care really matters a whole lot. As simple as, my manager checking in with me and, how's your mom doing? And things like that really make a big difference. And I think also just, checking in with the caregiver themselves as well. How are you doing through all of this? Are you taking time for yourself? What can I do to support you? And I think also just offering right up front, here, I'll do this for you. I'll take this off of your plate. And I think that goes within, your work, but also in personal life. When friends and family are, saying, how can I help you? Here, I'll do this for you.
So it sounds like the biggest story here is to make sure you check in on your friends and family and loved ones. You've been listening to Natalie Shurtleff, who's the Associate State Director of Advocacy and Outreach for AARP Connecticut, and she's also a member of the Sandwich Generation. Natalie, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
I'm Catherine Shen. Today's show is produced by Chloe Wynn. Our technical producer is Dylan Reyes. Download Where We Live anytime on your favorite podcast app. Thank you all so much for listening, and take care of each other, everyone.